I'm Kayte Lewis from Voice Lawyers, and this is Voice in the Crowd, the podcast for people, not lawyers. It's about demystifying the law, speaking in plain English, and sharing practical insights into how the legal system really works in everyday life. Each episode draws on real stories and experiences, the good, the bad, and the confusing. If you feel overwhelmed or confused by the law, or you're just interested in our stories, this podcast is for you. Voice in the Crowd, where the law meets real people. Today, we have a very special guest on the Voice in the Crowd podcast. Dr. Hayley North is with us. She is a neuroscientist, a research fellow at the Neuroscience Research Australia. She is also a lecturer at the University of New South Wales and the founder of Understand Your Brain, where she provides neuroscience-based mental health and wellbeing training to workplaces and CPD professional development for lawyers. Her research and publications cover molecular and genetic changes in mental illness, and she is a regular on the 7 Sunrise program. She's dedicated to transforming complex neuroscience into actionable strategies, empowering and fostering resilience, and developing strategies for lasting change. So, hello Hayley, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to having this conversation today.
Awesome. Well, the first question we have is, what on earth led you to become a neuroscientist?
Yeah, it was a long road that I think surprised a lot of people because I was into dance and drama in high school. But when I started university, I was studying psychology, and whenever I learned about, what's happening in the brain that creates these behaviours and things, I was absolutely fascinated. And from there, I switched everything and really focused my studies and my career, the PhD, all into neuroscience, because the brain is, to me, the most fascinating thing on the planet. It's just responsible for everything that makes us us, and having a deeper understanding of your brain can really help you in so many ways, because it drives all of our behaviours and experiences, I guess.
Amazing. I mean, that's a big step from being a dancer, isn't it?
Yeah.
But obviously a very worthwhile one.
Yeah.
So you have a particular interest in stress from all of the material that I've read about you. Why stress?
I think stress is just such an interesting topic. It impacts absolutely everybody, and all of my research is always towards, improving outcomes for people. I do a lot of research into mental illness as well, but stress is such an important factor in that because it impacts everybody. And if we know a little bit more about stress, it can have less of a harmful impact. There's so much out there around stress as being the worst thing in the world, but it isn't always, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But then, there are aspects of stress that we can manage ourselves too. Okay.
So as lawyers, we're fairly familiar with stress a lot of the time.
I can imagine.
As are our clients. Rarely do people come to us where they're not in a state of stress because particularly for us at Voice, we are litigators. So usually if people are here, they're here because they've got some form of conflict or a situation and they're usually under stress. So can you tell me a little bit more about the different types of stress? You said not all of it is bad.
Absolutely. So from a scientific perspective, we'd have what we'd call acute stress, which is short-term stress. It will resolve itself after a little while, and that's very normal. It's quite healthy to actually experience that stress response to something that is genuinely stressful, like litigation, for example. But the difference really lies in whether that stress response is resolved or it becomes chronic stress. So that's more of a long-term stress where it feels like we can't necessarily escape from it. We're having troubles performing normally at work or functioning normally, trouble sleeping. All of those kind of things fall into this chronic, more long-term stress category, which can have more harms associated with it. Okay,
so that's a clue for us then when we start to feel that we've got some other symptoms then that this is becoming a chronic situation. Is that how we would tell?
Absolutely. I think it depends on the severity of the stress. If it's a little bit of stress every day, you go, oh, well, I was stressed every day. It's not necessarily the same as huge stress. You're feeling those physical symptoms of it. And I think the best indicator we have for whether we are in that chronic stress state is whether we can sleep or not. Because our sleep can be impacted by other things, especially hormonal changes as well, and light. If we're getting too much light and stimulation in the evening, that can also impact our sleep. But if we're chronically stressed and not able to switch out of that stress state into what we'd call a parasympathetic, our rest and digest state, then that's a really obvious sign that, maybe we need to do a little bit more work in being able to switch from the stress state to the rest state.
Okay. So what's the problem with chronic stress then? What's likely to happen to us if we stay in that chronic stress state?
It does differ, but it increases our risk, and there's thousands of studies showing this. So it increases our risk for mental illness and physical illness as well. So our stress system is very much this physical thing, even though we feel like stress is just mental and, it's not affecting our body. It's affecting our brain and body to such an extent that if we're in that chronic stress state, we are more likely to have a flare-up of our mental illnesses. So if we are prone to depression, anxiety disorders, even schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, any of those, the symptoms can become worse in a state of chronic stress. Or if we'd never had them before, we have an increased risk of actually having one of those disorders. So that's the more mental health risk of chronic stress. But then the physical health risk is really quite interesting as well. Like, we think of stress being psychological, but you have an increased risk or severity of cardiovascular disorders. So that's, things to do with your heart. Immune disorders, so especially autoimmune disorders, that's really, can be triggered, like asthma, for example, can be triggered by stressful situations, especially chronic stress. And then even metabolic disorders, so things like diabetes and things like that, that can become triggered by chronic stress as well. So it's really something that we do have control over. We really need to take that control over it as well to reduce the risk for any of those things that we want to be avoiding.
Okay, gosh, that's fairly serious. So
not to stress you out about being stressed, because that can happen.
Okay, so Hayley, we've talked about all of those very serious things that can happen with stress, and if you could give us a little bit more of an understanding between the difference between the short-term and the long-term stress, what's happening in our body physically and at a molecular level, and with this, amazing brain that we've got.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question to kind of unpack, like what physically is happening in our brains and bodies when we launch this whole stress response. And it really comes back to our evolution. So as humans, like our evolution takes an incredibly long time, and our stress system has been so important throughout our entire evolution. But unfortunately, society changes so much faster than our biology has a chance to keep up with. So we're still left with this stress system that doesn't necessarily match what our stresses are. So we very much have like workplace stress, family stress, but our body still launches this whole physical response. So what happens is basically we have a stressful thing happen. Parts of our brain register that, like the amygdala, for example, that like alerts us like we have to focus, there's a whole stress response happening. Our hypothalamus, this is a part of our brain that then releases hormones into our bloodstream that go throughout our entire body, and called corticotropin releasing factor. You don't need to know the name of it. You did ask for molecules.
I did.
Careful what you wish for. But so we release that into the body, and then our adrenal glands, which sit on top of the kidneys actually, that releases cortisol and adrenaline throughout our entire body and signals to our muscles, to our blood vessels, to our brain again, to be on high alert, to increase our heart rate, to have a really, strong focus on the stressor. We can't focus on many other things because that cortisol in our brain and body is really telling us to stay focused. And it affects all of those other systems. And that's why it starts to explain some of those physical symptoms that we can have from long-term chronic stress. So if your body is being told, like, my heart rate has to be increased, and that's your heart rate's always increased because you're always in this stress state, that puts pressure on that system. Your that physical stress system, that axis I was talking about, it's called the HPA axis, so the hypothalamus, cortical and adrenal sort of system, that axis then will tell your immune system to become active and, you know, either fight off infection. And that's why when we're burnt out after, you know, being in a stress state for so long, we usually get sick because our immune system's been active for so long, it just kind of can't fight things off anymore, that sort of thing. So that's why we do have very physical symptoms associated with this stress response, because it starts in the brain but goes throughout the whole body and then signals back to the brain again. But we have this feedback loop from a molecular level again, where our brain will register, you know, that we've got cortisol, and we're, okay, well, that's been high for a certain amount of time. It will reduce our ability to produce more. So it really normally regulates itself, which is really great. It's very healthy, and that's how we do we are able to be in that short-term stress response, because the brain will register, okay, we've had cortisol on board for enough time, let's dampen down that effect and we'll go back to normal functioning. However, if we've been in that stress state for too long, like more and more stresses are coming our way, then the brain's negative feedback system actually starts to not work so well anymore, and it can actually switch to a positive feedback loop, which is not quite positive. It means that cortisol actually fuels more cortisol. So studies came out in the last few years actually showing that is one of the reasons why chronic stress should be avoided. You know, if we see stress early, we want to notice those early warning signs, put in place those strategies to manage it so that it doesn't become chronic and become that feedback loop. That's like, you know, that kind of self-fulfilling cycle that's harder to break out of.
Wow, that's really challenging because I know when you get to a certain, I think maybe it's just my social media algorithm, but it's constantly telling me about cortisol. I hope that's not just me. I hope that's not just my specific algorithm.
It's hugely trending. But there's also people like, oh, cortisol detox, cortisol's all bad. I did mention some bad aspects of cortisol, but it's also good. It gets us up in the morning. So it's part of our like natural 24-hour circadian rhythm, which is this rhythm that regulates like when we sleep, when we don't. And cortisol actually helps us wake up, get functioning, be alert, get out of a sleep state. So it's not all bad. And cortisol can help us feel energized. Too little cortisol can also lead to signs of depression, you know, that lethargy, you know, hopelessness, that kind of thing as well. So it's a very complicated system. We don't want to say cortisol's all bad because it can help, but having that cortisol elevated prolonged, you know, can be problematic.
So one of the things that has just popped to mind for me was a conversation I had a few years ago with a judge.
Yeah.
And I won't say who the judge was, but it was part of my training that I was doing around advocacy. And when we go to court, and I know you do some CPD for lawyers, and we have specifically said that this podcast is not for lawyers, so just give us a moment here while I segue. You know, we get really nervous, you know, and I've been doing this for, how long have I been doing it for? 13, 14 years. And this was probably about 6 or 7 years ago that I did this additional advocacy training, you know. So when you've got court that day, you generally, I don't know, I'm fairly stressed and on alert, and a lot of the barristers that I know are as well. And I said during this training, I asked the question, I said, like, does this go away? And this very highly experienced judge says, no, it doesn't go away until you stop being an advocate. And she said the first day she didn't wake up without diarrhea was when she became a judge.
Wow.
So I guess, you know, there's lots of stuff, particularly that the Law Society is always putting out to us about managing stress and resilience and mental health in the law. But it's really hard because we are constantly in fairly stressful situations.
Yeah.
And I think so are our clients as well.
Yeah.
So supposing, you know, we've got clients that have been in litigation. Often litigations will run for, you know, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, especially if they're family law. So what can we do if we're in one of these chronic situations?
I think firstly, like educating yourself. So if the people listening to this podcast, great, like that's the first little tick, you know, and, you know, seeking out more information around this stress response, what's happening. So that's the first little bit, just that education around it. And then there's so many strategies that actually help. So anything that's good for your brain is going to be able to help regulate your stress system. So the first couple of things that I think
not alcohol then.
Well, that's, yeah, exactly. That is, I have this whole thing. I actually went on Sunrise to talk about hangxiety, which is like hangover anxiety. Because when you drink, and it's often because you want to feel less stressed, you want to feel like, you know, less social stress and those kind of things. And you feel great, you know, when you've had a few drinks. But the brain always tries to reach balance. It always tries to, like, we call it homeostasis, but it just tries to get back to baseline. So if you were feeling super relaxed that night, the next day your brain's trying to balance that out and you don't have the alcohol anymore. So you end up feeling more stressed than you were the day before. So it's like the brain trying to reach balance, but it kind of goes a little bit too far in the other direction because it's going, oh, we don't have enough of what's called GABA in the brain. You know, the GABA system's kind of been blocked. Let's like increase glutamate or whatever. Like, so it just changes the whole system around, and then you end up feeling the opposite of what you'd want the alcohol to have done. So it's a very, very, very short term fix, and then it doesn't really fix it because the problem's even worse than if you hadn't done it the next day. So
yes,
the keys to kind
I think I've experienced that.
Yeah, I've always experienced anxiety. Like if I think about what I did the night before, I go, oh my God, did I really say that? And it's even way worse, you know. What did I say, you know? Anyway, but there are real like things that we can do. So if we think back to that evolutionary stress system I was talking about, we don't need that increased adrenaline. We don't need the, you know, increased blood pressure and all of the things that our stress response is doing. What our stress response is for is because when we evolved, it was this fight or flight response. We had to either fight off a predator or run, you know, seek shelter, all of these things which involved a lot of physical movement. But nowadays our stresses are very much psychological. And our body's response is very different. So one of the first things we need to do is start exercising because that's what our body is expecting when we're in that stress state. So it kind of helps balance out all of those molecules that are changed because your body's expecting that. So, you know, moderate cardio, all this research has been done into the types of exercise that can help. So high intensity cardio can actually lead to a little more cortisol and adrenaline. So you don't necessarily want to be doing that if you're in a super stressed state. But doing moderate intensity exercise like walking, jogging, basically anything you can do while you can still have a conversation, that's what you want to be doing because that's really working with your body's response to stress and giving it what it wants, that little bit of outlet to get rid of those stress hormones, use up that energy that's been produced by the stress response and get you back to baseline because otherwise it just keeps building up. If we just stay at our desks in the courtroom all day, then, you know, it can keep building up. So that's, I think, one of the best tips that actually works based on thousands of studies.
And is that something we need to do quite close to the state of feeling stressed, or is it just something that we need to sort of build into our routines, or both?
Both. It's always better to, you know, get regular exercise, especially for the brain, like for your physical brain health, but then also for that stress response. I guess, you know, it depends on the individual. Some people really feel like they need that outlet for really high stress situations where they do need to run and use up all that energy. So you need to do a few experiments with yourself. If that makes you feel worse afterwards, don't do that, do the moderate cardio. But if you feel like you're so stressed that you need that outlet, you need to just do something high intense like an exercise, then and you feel like your energy's back to baseline, then, you know, do that. So I would even keep like a little journal. How did you feel after this exercise? And kind of look at it more objectively.
Okay. So exercise,
amazing.
Not the alcohol.
Yep.
So disappointing, but I'm not surprised. What else can we do?
Sleep is essential for regulating our stress response, so especially for our resilience to handle stressful situations. So this is something, if you know you have a lot of stressful things coming up, like you're going to be going through a divorce, for example, you want to be starting to make sure you're getting consistent sleep, so like going to bed and waking up at the same time each day, roughly, and also getting adequate hours of sleep. So 7 to 9 hours is really recommended. It's different for different individuals, but that's like broadly across the average, like that is the amount of sleep we should be getting. So the whole reason behind this is that our brain is, you know, processing so much, like physically while we're asleep, clearing out debris so we can function clearly the next day. And that our cognition will work well, so that's our problem-solving abilities and all of that. That's all being processed while we're sleeping, our memory, that sort of thing. But we're also living out stressful scenarios in our dreams that then help us build resilience to stress the next day. So if we've all experienced that, like you would have probably had an all-nighter and the next day you can't even function, and something that wasn't stressful is hugely stressful the next day.
I was telling you about my dream. Before
Exactly.
I was stressed about my daughter going sailing, and I had a dream that she was being chased by a shark because she was at the back of the fleet.
It's terrifying.
That was a terrible dream.
But the fact you had that has built your resilience the next day to handle stressful situations. It's like kind of this exposure therapy that our brains do. Like, and I guess that's another segue. Like, you know, our brains give us a little bit of therapy when we're sleeping during REM sleep. But sometimes that's not enough, and sometimes actually seeking support from a psychologist, psychiatrist, our GP, when, you know, stress is getting to that stage of being overwhelming. There's amazing therapies that don't involve medication. There's amazing therapies that do involve medication that can make a huge difference, so that you don't need to necessarily be suffering as well. So sleep gives us that bit of therapy, but sometimes it's not quite enough, and we do need that extra bit, which can make a huge difference to our response to and our ability to handle it, you know.
And so, I mean, there's probably more that we can do, but what happens to our ability to make effective decisions when we're under, well, I guess chronic stress. Is that what we're talking about mostly now? Like when we've been under stress for a long time?
What's interesting is that short term, our focus becomes quite narrow, and we are able to, like, you know, be super focused. We notice we're pretty productive. If we're in that stress state, we've got that deadline, something big's just happened. We're like, oh wow, I smashed out that report. I, you know, nailed that moment in court because I had that adrenaline. But sometimes we rely on that too much. So because we do get that little boost of energy when we're stressed, we start to go, oh, I'll leave stuff to the last minute now because, you know, I do function so well in that stress state. But there's always a catch when it comes to the brain. You know, if we're using that too much and we're then in the chronic state of stress, we then are less able to make good decisions. We start to rely on old habits rather than being able to think creatively and think clearly. We start to make more mistakes when we're in that state of chronic stress, a state of burnout. We're usually generally quite exhausted. We're not, you know, in a great place to be making decisions. So if our sleep's impacted, then it's like just an added impact because stress and sleep are related, but our ability to make great decisions and think clearly depends on how well we've slept the night before as well. So it's all kind of related. So if we're getting our sleep and stress system in a good place, then we're, you know, better able to make decisions as well.
So I guess then that brings me to the types of people that we would be, you know, working with here. So we might have workplaces that are looking at, say, workplace investigations, or you know, we might be advising employers on how to deal with, you know, situations that arise, or employees that are being investigated, not to mention our family law clients. We might get to those a little bit later on.
Yeah.
But so if I'm obviously they're stressful situations, and sometimes they go on for a little while. So what I'm hearing you say then is that, you know, if we've got an employee, let's say I'm a manager and I've got an employee and they're going through a workplace investigation, perhaps a complaint's been made against them, then I should expect that their performance might drop during that. Is that what I could take away from that?
Potentially. It's so dependent. Some individuals are more resilient to stress than others. Like, some people might be able to handle that, you know, without it impacting them in such a huge way. But others, you know, depending on their upbringing, their genetics, all of this, it might, you know, end up being quite a chronic state of stress. It might start to impact other aspects of their life, and including work performance. So it really is individual, and I think, you know, acknowledging that stress is this big physical thing that people don't necessarily choose to have that experience, and being really empathetic as a leader around that can make a huge difference to someone's ability to perform and, you know, feel like they can continue contributing if they feel supported in that role.
And I guess if I'm the employee going through that, then I need to make sure that I'm building some of these resilience factors around me as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, looking after your physical health helps with your stress system, you know, getting that sleep. There's little strategies we can do as well to make sure we're noticing that we're not in that chronic stress state for too long. Like, meditation is a really good way that enables us to tune in internally. It's called interoception. And if we have really good interoception, we're able to recognize when we're stressed pretty early, rather than letting it just run wild. Start to put in place strategies like breathing exercises, stress reduction exercises, like, you know, body scan meditations, things like that, that can start to bring our stress levels down in the moment as well. So, like, if you were going through that, like, litigation process at work and you were the one being investigated, you know, being able to acknowledge that stress early and manage it as it's happening is going to help as well.
Right. Okay. And then I guess just understanding that's what's going on can make a big difference in the workplace. What about for people that are going through the longer term litigation? You know, they can't get away from it. They're often experiencing a whole, and look, well, I'll say family law, but it really could be any litigation.
Yeah.
Litigation goes on for, you know, a long time often. I mean, is there anything else that they can do apart from trying to regulate? What other help can they give themselves?
I think one of the really important aspects of regulating our stress and being resilient to stressful situations that I haven't mentioned yet is having good social connections. So our brains evolved to be very social animals. You know, we're connected in groups. And if it's like a family law situation, for example, where, you know, that family unit and that connection is kind of breaking down, that can cause a lot more stress. So making sure you have that support from friends, it could be family, it could be, you know, a psychologist, you know, making sure you have those connections where you still feel like you have support. It can even just be that one person you just are able to talk to about things. It could be, you know, a few good friends that you catch up with weekly, or sister, or, you know, your kids or something. Just if you make sure you're maintaining those relationships, even when you seem busy, it's almost a non-negotiable for your mental health in those kind of situations. So, you know, we often think of like, oh, socializing, like, oh, that's a nice to have. But really, it's going to, if you're able to keep, you know, your social life up, or, you know, whatever it is, whatever connections work in your life, keeping them strong is going to really help your stress system become regulated.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because this came up in one of our other podcasts, is that how when particularly in relation to family law, that you lose a lot of your social connections, or many people do, for various reasons. And we were talking about this in a financial sense.
Yeah.
But trying to maintain those friendships and those connections, because you can't always talk to your lawyer about everything. You need to be able to talk to other people and have that group of people in place. It's really important.
Exactly. And I think it's important, like, not only to have those connections you can talk to about, you know, the serious things, but even just to catch up about and connect over something totally unrelated. You know, it doesn't mean that you have to, all your relationships have to be, you know, a serious discussion about the litigation. You also need to just have these other connections in your life that might, you know, bring you joy, make you feel like you're needed or helpful or a part of something, even if it's a hobby that you take up and, you know, you've made a new friend and you just are with them occasionally doing a hobby. Like, it can make a huge difference. Yeah.
Because you can become really focused on this enormous thing in your life, which becomes the litigation, to try and give that some normality and some balance.
100%.
It probably also, I mean, I would say that it helps us if you're looking after those things, because then we can get better instructions as well from people. It becomes a bit more part of what's happening rather than the only thing that's happening.
Yeah.
All right. So, Hayley, you do a lot of work in organisations and research. Tell me a little bit more about the research that you're doing at the moment.
So at the moment, out of Neuroscience Research Australia, a lot of the research I do is into the neurobiology of mental illness. So it's very much like lab coat experiments with post-mortem human brain tissue. And we look at, I know it sounds a bit grim for some people, but I find it fascinating, especially, you know, when we do stuff with microscopy, like we'll stain the brain tissue with certain fluorescent probes, look at things under the microscope, and it's like this beautiful image that comes out, and then we're able to quantify what different cells are doing in the brain and body. A lot of my research at the moment is involving what our immune response, so inflammation, and how that impacts our mental health. And I did mention earlier, like, it's quite related, that immune system, to our stress response, but it's also related to our mental health too. So I look at that on a very molecular genetic ways, like see what's happening in different brain cells by looking at what we call RNA, but also what different cell types are changed based on what inflammatory molecules are in there changing their behaviour. But from a more real day-to-day life perspective, what that kind of means is, you know, if we've felt sick, like had a cold, for example, most of us have experienced the effects of those immune molecules on our brain. You know, we feel that brain fog, hard to concentrate, we feel like pretty down sometimes, you don't really want to get out of bed, you feel like, you know, pretty flat. Symptoms can overlap with symptoms of depression sometimes when we're, you know, feeling really sick. And that's because our immune system is really signaling to the brain to rest, don't function properly. You know, we need to dedicate all of that energy to the rest of the body, which was super helpful for most of the time we were evolving. Like, we really need to rest when we're sick. But sometimes we have inflammation due to other things, like, you know, chronic stress can lead to inflammation even though we're not sick, or, you know, physical health issues. So if we haven't, you know, been taking care of our bodies, that can lead to inflammation as well, which can then lead to those mental health symptoms, which is really, you know, a lot of people don't think about it, but that's why I think it's important to get this message across, that what we're doing for our bodies can really help our brain, which can then help our mental health, which we think is totally separate, but it's so related.
Okay, so also I presume our diet and all of those sorts of things are all affecting our brain.
Yeah.
You know, that you are what you eat. I mean, that was, we did that at school.
Yeah, but it takes it that step further, because, you know, we are what our brains are doing, and our brains are part of this body that we should be taking care of. Yeah.
So it's very comprehensive then, and it seems it could be overwhelming for people to think, well, where do I start?
I think the best thing about that, like when people are like, oh, well, where do you start? Even if you start with one thing, it usually has flow-on effects to other things. Like, for example, exercising, doing moderate cardio, for example, like going for walks every day, swimming, bike riding, whatever you enjoy. That then has impacts like you're better able to fall asleep at night. And then your sleep health improves. And then your cognition improves. Like most of these little things we do have flow-on effects. So just starting with something, maybe it's sleep. If you're well rested, you're better able to start exercising more. You know, like just choose one of those things that you think could work. So it could be nutrition, could be eating healthy, and then you feel more energized to exercise, you know, or exercise, or sleep, or you know, being mindful, like, you know, paying attention to those stress responses in your body, tackling that, you know, chronic stress. Like, just choose one of them and it will have flow-on effects into the others as well.
Awesome. So in terms of organisations that you're working with and perhaps applying this research, who should get in touch with you?
I always say, like, anyone who has a brain can benefit from learning more about the brain, because it really is, you know, most employers, the way they make their money is through, you know, employees using their brains in certain ways. So if it is like a good return on investment to really look after the brains of employees, but also if like people are going through change at work, that is a huge thing that's happening at the moment with AI. Anyone whose workplaces who are going through a lot of change, people are starting to get burnt out because of the uncertainty and stress associated with that. So I do all these new workshops based on how we can understand the brain better to respond to change and build resilience to stress. I do a whole workshop on sleep, the sleep and the circadian rhythm, brain hacks for productivity. I've got, you can just check out the website and see how it would relate. So basically,
website, Understand Your Brain?
Yeah, .com.au, or you can Google my name, Dr. Hayley North. It usually comes up.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I've learnt a lot as well about the legal side of things too. Like, gosh, 3 or 4 years of litigation, that sounds like huge. I didn't know that.
Well,
thankfully,
we hope that it doesn't, but that is not unusual. So,
wow.
Well, there seems like there's a whole lot to do. So if people want to get in touch with you, they can get in touch with you through the website. You can reach out to us at Voice in the Crowd, and we will put you in touch.
Sure.
If you're an organisation and you'd like to be in touch with Dr. Hayley. But thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge with us today.
Thank you.
And we look forward to maybe talking again sometime.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Just before you leave, I have a quick but important note. What we've discussed in this podcast is general information only. It's not legal advice, and it's not a substitute for getting advice tailored to your specific situation. The law, and family law and employment law particularly, are highly fact-specific. Small details can make a big difference. So if something we talked about resonates with you, we encourage you to get proper advice before taking any action. Nothing in this podcast creates a lawyer-client relationship, but we're always happy to point you in the right direction. If there is something you'd like us to discuss, please reach out and let us know, and I hope you tune in next time.